sanctions, international law, and national security. This is the theme of Rashtriya Suraksha Samvad, December 2020. Economic warfare has become reality sooner than we expected. Economic sanctions, instruments of coercive diplomacy, have become the perfect tool. Economic sanctions, smart and targeted sanctions, are all weaponry of economic lawfare. Use of physical force, if remains a legitimate option for international order based on stability of international peace and security, these measures are nothing but aim to contribute a particular international economic and financial order, promoting interests of a particular country or group of countries only. The key stakeholders of our economy, industry, trade, investment houses, all are juggling with the critical questions. These questions acquire even more significance as the United States undergoes the transition. How their short-term operations and finances are affected by these coercive diplomatic instruments? Can they remain on receiving end if the compatibility and legitimacy of sanctions imposed by states and also amenable UN Security Council are questioned? What are the connections between sanctions and individual rights, including rights of individual nature and legal persons? What are the impacts of sanctions on existing treaties and, more importantly, contracts for the economic entities? What are the impacts of sanctions on non-state actors? What are the emerging state practice, especially of United States and European Union, and how to place the Indian state practice vis-a-vis these actors? What are the extraterritorial effects of national legislation implementing sanctions? How the UN legitimacy and credibility in view of increasing recourse to unilateral or regional sanctions is irreversibly eroded. CAATSA 2017 has indeed provided an excellent episode in international law and relations to analyze these questions and how implementation of CAATSA, that is countering America's adversary through Sanctions Act, will help countries like India in formulating strategies of survival to effectively deal with these and other sanctions. Friends, sanctions are normally seen as for their role in maintaining peace and security. There are indeed positive but also negative aspects of sanctions if compared to other coercive instruments. What lessons the developing countries, including India and other fast-growing economies, have drawn from the negative impacts of sanctions? Third parties should consider adopting laws similar to Japanese law of 1997 when faced with US sanctions and if it is in contrary with international law. The direct and indirect damages to economy, trade and commerce are irreparable. Sanctions do not necessarily further international law goals, only foreign policy interests of a targeting state and subservient state. Third-party states will experience graduated intensification over a short of time, and therefore a well-calibrated policy and practical responses are imperative. A third state, I can say subservient state, cannot play into the hands of a state launching global economic lawfare. A comprehensive analysis of the new norms is required to be done by the policymakers and scholars alike. How a third party, which genuinely feels deprived of its rights under public international law, can be expected to comply in letter and spirit, it is a myth. credible detailed survey on the effect of sanctions is already due. Under pressure but also growing ally of the US, the Indian position that foreign policy goals of both nations will be adversely impacted vis-à-vis each other and common good is appreciable. India can make it clear what precisely US would like to achieve from applying certain measures against India. If sanctions measures are applied against India, then it becomes a justiciable case because neither India has breached any obligations towards USA nor it owes any duty to the USA. Hence, unilateral sanctions which US imposes on Russia or Iran are non-forcible countermeasures vis-à-vis India. The measures, if invoked against India, would be not only non-admissible, but whatever those could be considered as disproportional to the violation of any breach suffered. What the advocates of sanctions would argue is that a state can resort to augment customary international law because the frequent use of sanctions constitutes evidence that no clear norms exist against them in customary international law. While the law is unsettled with regard to the target state, any application of such measures against third state is clearly contrary to customary as well as treaty law. Third states like India shall resist such consolidation of norm. All 5 key types of sanctions, standard categories such as currency restrictions, financial restrictions, capital controls, other controls, import registration requirements, bans on defense contracts, voluntary bans on new direct investment in target states, and distribution of sanctions by state have limitations and raise fundamental questions of undermining international law. It is clear that US policy is opposed to secondary boycott effects, namely, sanctions are applied not only against Russia or Iran, but also against natural and legal persons of India and the Indian state if they maintain relations or engage in transactions with Russia or Iran. What appears in the current case is that US aims to justify an extraterritorial breach of the CAATSA by invoking the effects doctrine. In US view, international law recognizes that a nation has the ability to provide for rules of law with respect to conduct outside its territory that has or is intended to have substantial effect within its territory with regard to sanctions as well. Although US foreign policy law stipulated along these lines is clear, this type of exercise of jurisdiction is supposed to be constrained by reasonableness requirement. This is certainly not supported by international law and results into secondary boycott. Current sanctions as instruments of coercive diplomacy. Military coercion is largely gone and is replaced with economic and political coercion. Although coercion themselves may be considered as not absolutely prohibited, but are these not actually interventions and as such fall under the ambit of prohibition? Treaties, United Nations resolutions, and customary law all prohibit interventions. While sanctions are largely matter of the UN Security Council mandate, what states unilaterally or regionally like US and EU do against Russia or Iran are countermeasures. In fact, the very title of CAATSA carries some legally dubious distinction. These nations believe that the targeted states have committed international wrongful act, making them candidate for subject to countermeasures. As we focus on economic coercion, to what extent such coercion is permissible and what are the possible reactions against impermissible forms of coercion? Don't economic sanctions trigger the right of economic self-defense by the target states? Does not sovereign immunity limit to the admissibility of economic sanctions? Which obligations must be respected by the state resorting to countermeasures? in context of India, is India or other similarly situated nations entitled to react with counter sanctions to looming restrictive measures? It is clear. Economic countermeasures are admissible only when a previous international wrong has been committed by the target state. If the countermeasures are illegitimate, the target state can react with restrictive measures which can be dubbed as counter sanctions. Examining the categories of sanctions, we find import-export bans, financial transactions and freezing of assets ban, and limitations to the freedom of movement of persons. Import-export bans are not necessarily prohibited under general international law, but they do violate treaty law such as GATT, that is General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, specifically violation of most favored nation rule, prohibition of quantity restrictions. Financial sanctions can violate the General Agreement on Trading Services and also private property rights and issues of human rights. The global community is based upon a system of interconnected economies, and cases of economic coercion are even more coercive than certain surgical strikes of physical force. Certain European sanctions, in context of EU sanctions on Iran in 2012, used to believe that from a legal point of view, sanctions are merely unfriendly acts and are always admissible when they do not imply any violation of international obligations. The question is, when such measures destroy the economic and financial interests of a third state, for example India, can they be considered mere unfriendly acts? States cannot be deprived of the right to take countermeasures provided that they are in consonance or accordance with international law. Actors of sanctions regime. Alongside UN Security Council, individual states and regional organizations have started making use of sanctions. For example, the European Union calls them restrictive measures. Apparently, more than 30 EU restrictive measures regimes are in place. EU guidelines on sanctions condemn, like US, extraterritoriality when it is in breach of international law, and while restrictive measures do not envisage aggressive extraterritorial measures. In practice, EU is often successful in obtaining compliance with its measures from third states. What USA CAATSA seeks is the multilateralization of unilateral sanctions, as it not only seeks the voluntary participation of India and other countries to implement measures against Russia or Iran, but attempts to impose obligations on India to abide by unilateral sanctions. The extraterritoriality backs examination from 3 points: general international law and theory of jurisdiction, international economic law, and informal settlements and international law of state practice. CAATSA includes the use of coercion, and it cannot be exercised outside the territory of the state without the permission of, let's say, India, in which the coercive act occurs. The French, the Dutch, and even EU courts jurisprudence suggest that they reject the extraterritorial legislation. EU in fact adopted in 1996 regulation 2271, which aimed at protecting economic and financial interests of natural and legal persons against the effects of the extraterritorial application of US legislation. In 1997, Japan adopted legislative countermeasures which authorized the Japanese government to recover the fines from the American shipping companies because shipping companies had nothing to do with cargo handling in a Japanese port. The countermeasures were, however, not invoked, but Japan had very difficult negotiations with the United States. Unilateral sanctions with extraterritorial effects are contrary to international law because they infringe upon the principle of non-intervention. Countries like India may suffer and are suffering from the application of such legislation when their nationals are sanctioned on the basis of such legislation. Are there remedies? Yes. Non-recognition of foreign legislation with extraterritorial effects, non-recognition of foreign orders, of judicial decisions implementing such legislation, and the standard diplomatic representation mechanisms are some of the legally valid remedies. Unfortunately, these legal solutions are insufficient as the sanctioning state can remain very powerful and private international law of domestic state of countries like India suffers from traditional weaknesses. Apart from targeted state entities, the current regime of US and EU target non-state actors. The increasing relevance of non-state actors is inherently linked to the move towards smart sanctions against individuals or entities deemed responsible for breaches of international law or threats to international peace and security. CAATSA, for example, not only targets non-state actors but also fall under more precise or more surgical measures against state leaders or elites within states. It remains fine as far as support of these actors towards international law is concerned. However, the question remains, non-state genuine economic and financial actors who are affected by such precise sanctions. Sanctions and human rights protections. Can India, for example, although not a directly injured state, invoke US or EU responsibility as they are breaching obligations they owe to the whole international community? Are targeted individuals and entities such as defense, energy and financial houses of India entitled to individual rights protection, and which is the applicable legal framework under international law? Individuals and entities are entitled to individual rights protection and have the right to effective judicial protection with its corollaries, but also the freedom of movement, right to respect for personal and family life, right to personal freedom, right to property, and proportionality. The individual right to compensation for harm suffered as a consequence of listing is also an issue. With regard to these rights, it may be noted that there is some complexity. The scope of human rights standards enshrined in the UN Charter or applicable to the UN is relatively vague and disputed, while the resolutions adopted by the UN Security Council are under a special regime by reason of Article 103 of the UN Charter. Counter-proliferation sanctions generally are not only unsuccessful but even counterproductive. International sanctions aimed at changing a state's behavior in a domain in which it has a sovereign right to decide freely certain represent a violation of the customary norm of non-intervention. Impact of sanctions on contracts. Our analysis must shift to national level as it is domestic law that is applicable legal framework. Putting in context of India, Indian Contract Act 1872 and amendments provide a number of contractual remedies that Indian entities can trigger or would have thought of triggering in case of breach of a contract. But these would not have been viable, at least from business strategy perspective, as these were affected by the fear of implementation of sanctions. For instance, the possibility of filing a claim to seek performance of the relevant contractual obligation would not be viable because the party would be in a position in which it cannot perform the obligation due to the sanctions constraints. Thus, one should rather consider which possible remedies are provided in our laws in order to seek compensation and to unilaterally terminate contracts. Contract termination may indeed be triggered, but it would be recommendable to include in international contract specific clauses that clearly define the consequences of targeted sanctions on the fate of the contract itself. Is it possible now, in view of the sanction, to redefine the contract at this stage? Can, for example, Indian entities de-sign the contracts with Iranian, Russian, and even US companies? It is widely argued and believed that economic coercion is in principle not prohibited under international customary law. But the limits posed by the principle of non-intervention must be investigated. In other words, sanctions are to stay as a viable and, although legitimacy fully debated, one of the most used tools for bilateral and multilateral outcomes. The sanctions which US target India are nothing but coercive international economic sanctions. They are in normal parlance not to comprise a breach of Article 2.4 of the UN Charter per se, which prohibits the threat or use of international force, nor on their own to constitute the commencement of an armed conflict. Nevertheless, in a meaningful sense, coercive sanctions adopted during peacetime are a means of economic warfare. From developing countries' perspective, the war is imposed upon them to deprive them of their economic development. Thus, economic coercion is an alternative to armed conflict. Based on the right-based jurisprudence approach of Indian judiciary, the effects of economic coercion of US would be amounting to violation of human rights, right to development, right to access to health and education, and the right to life. Indian judiciary will have to take stern position in compelling the institutions to resist any economic coercion, for otherwise there is a danger of both failing to serve their population. In this sense, can we not say that economic sanctions are purposed in coercing Indian entities to change their behavior could be construed as measures of economic warfare, potentially no less destructive in their effects upon them as well as the Indian state than military force? Sanctions and international arbitration. Whether the applicability of US economic sanctions can render disputes inarbitrable or deprive tribunals of jurisdiction. The available case law and literature suggest that arbitral tribunals will find that the presence of US sanctions regime will not render the dispute inarbitrable. What are the possibilities of refusing recognition and enforcement of an arbitral award based on the public policy or non-arbitrability grounds? The specific features of the award, the nature of the sanctions regime in place, and of course, the interpretation of the public policy or non-arbitrability exceptions by the enforcing jurisdiction, be it India or other states, will need to be considered in any given case. Indian, or for that matter other three states, will find refusal to enforce likely only where clear and direct breach of the sanctions regime in place in the enforcing jurisdiction has been established. Although this has not occurred much in practice, but the companies, trade houses and arbitrators too will soon grapple with this complex legal web. As the arbitration between these four nations, India, US, Russia and Iran, are not so many, at least in reported records, the question at least remains academic at this stage. But Indian or American arbitrators will be personally bound by the provisions of sanctions imposed and will need to give consideration to regime in place in India or US and at the seat of arbitration as well. More controversially, potentially applicable third state regime. While The carve-out provisions may well authorize individuals acting as arbitrators in international cases. Arbitrators are often required to apply to the competent authorities for exemption in order to accept appointment and should do so unless there is a clear authorization in place permitting arbitral appointments. Several of the American professors and attorneys are involved in arbitration involving India as a party and a third state. Thus, American arbitrators will be looking for exemption from the US authorities. Similar considerations apply to arbitratory institutions of US as well. As entities organized under the laws of certain jurisdictions and doing business there, they are bound by the sanctions regime in place in their home jurisdictions and must therefore perform similar acts of due diligence, compliance and reporting as do arbitrators before accepting cases or accepting money from disputing parties. The impact of sanctions upon arbitration is marked. In view of CAATSA and otherwise also, one can confront other issues as there is little any regulatory and professional guidance available to the nascent professional community of international arbitrators on these critical issues. Sanctions and contractual disputes. As a matter of principle, domestic courts and arbitral tribunals have the authority to give effect to measures such as economic sanctions which serve public interests, whether the measures under consideration have been imposed by the form state, by the state of the applicable law, or by yet another state. Two questions are important. Whenever a party claims in court or arbitral proceedings that it should be freed from its obligations on the ground that their performance is prohibited by an economic sanction, should the sanction be taken into account for the resolution of the dispute? And if so, how does the sanction affect the contract and the parties' rights and obligations? Can Indian entities maintain that a sanction should be regarded as an impediment to the performance of contractual obligations only if the party required to withhold performance is legally bound to comply with it? That is, if the sanction has a valid claim under rules and or principles of private international law to limit the party's contractual freedom either as an element of the applicable law or as an overriding mandatory rule external thereto. There are encompassing effects of economic sanctions on transactions between private players. A sanction may not only constitute an exonerating impediment to performance while it is enforced, but because of the uncertain and often lengthy term of such measure, Indian entities may even be prevented from resuming performance under the contractually agreed terms, if at all, after a sanction has been lifted. Indeed, despite the temporary nature of economic sanctions, resuming performance under the initially agreed terms after the sanction is lifted may not be possible if, as a result of change in market conditions, performance has become radically more onerous or dramatically less profitable for one of the parties. This may mean that sanctions may lead to a permanent disruption of the contracts between Indian and other foreign parties. This could be a devastating scenario for Indian companies and individuals. Effects on financial institutions including banks. Settlement payments by foreign banks in connection with US sanctions include French Credit Agricole $787 million, Dutch ING Bank $690 million, UK Standard Chartered $227 million, HSBC $1.256 billion, and biggest one BNP Paribas $8.97 billion. All these settlements have one common feature, namely, United States asserted its domestic authority over conduct of these banks outside US, providing banking services to entities outside the US. CAATSA aims to extend its effect on foreign actors who engage in dealing with Iran and Russia. Thus, universalizing the Katsa regime at the cost of foreign policy approaches and interests of other states such as India. This US exercise of jurisdiction to impose secondary boycotts is contrary to international law because they seek unreasonably to coerce conduct that take place wholly outside US. The American Bar Association in 1998 recommended suggestions that outside the US all forms of extraterritorial transaction controls almost universally are regarded as an illegitimate interference in domestic affairs of other countries. There are also others who believe that secondary boycotts to be legal under international law under certain conditions, namely if there is sufficient evidence of a direct threat to the national and international security of the regulating state or in times of war. The CARSA implications for India do not meet this concern. US sanctions of third state party like India will have to meet permissible jurisdictional grounds, even if one is to consider that extraterritoriality is legal. Simply saying like what US does with regard to BNP Paribas case, national security interest, international public safety, processing dollar transactions through the US financial system on their own do not become permissible grounds. US may invoke two grounds. One, US dollar payments passed through US territory because they were made possible by the use of a US correspondent bank account. The other argument is that by processing the payments within the US, an entry may cause the US correspondent banks to violate US law, even if they do so unknowingly. Correspondent account based jurisdiction has been increasingly invoked by US authorities, but has not yet been tested in US courts. In US and international law scholarship, the validity of such an expansive reading of the territorial principle is indeed questions. Indeed, it would not satisfy the conditions set by the subjective territoriality principle, as this principle requires that a substantial part of the conduct takes place within the territory. The question comes, when two entities outside of the US contract for banking services that include payment services, will violate US law at all? The fact that the dollar portion of such payments, for example from Iranian entity to a Swedish entity as in BNP Paribas case, passes through US territory while the clearing system does not meet the substantial part threshold. One might imagine what would result from a contrary view. The US dollar is the world's primary currency and virtually all dollar transactions pass the US for clearing. To accept the correspondent account nexus as sufficient basis for jurisdiction is tantamount to accepting a limitless US jurisdiction. There is no basis in international law for such a far-reaching assumption. The effect doctrine. The other territorial aspect of the transaction process is that an Indian entity bank may cause the US correspondent bank to violate US law again, even if unknowingly. This involves jurisdiction based on the effects doctrine, which holds that if the conduct of an Indian bank produces direct, substantial and foreseeable effects within the US territory, then the US may claim jurisdiction. It is true that conduct of an Indian bank may have an effect in the United States if, as a consequence of a payment order, US banks violate domestic law. However, the effects doctrine does not offer a sufficient basis for US jurisdiction. First, one should recall that the effects doctrine is a controversial principle of jurisdiction, and certainly limitless effects doctrine is unfounded in any system of law. Specifically, there is no agreement that the effects-based jurisdiction is justified when the regulated conduct of Indian bank complies with the Indian laws. In case of India, If an Indian bank does not violate Indian laws, then how much validity of effects doctrine of US can extend becomes very contestable legal proposition. For activities not directly linked to the cause of the national security threat, the protective principle does not provide a sufficient basis for jurisdiction. An expansive interpretation of the national threat concept is not widely accepted in the international community, as evidenced by the retaliatory legislative reactions in Canada and Europe to the US use of the concept regarding Iran. Finally, the threat to international security suggests an application of the universality principle. This is problematic because this principle has not yet been accepted in the economic context. Even if the principle was deemed applicable in the context, the hurdles remains high. General unfounded assertions such as weapons of mass destruction, proliferation, human rights violation used by proponents would not be always sufficient to legalize or legitimize jurisdiction. In conclusion, if the extraterritorial application of economic sanctions law is to be justified under international law, it will likely be under the protective principle. However, the threshold to be met is high. Thus, the protective principle lacks the potential to serve as a justification for much of the extraterritorial application of export controls. India, the largest democracy and the fastest growing developing economy, is subjected to heavy national and international regulations. India will have to consider both proactive and reactive claims of extraterritorial jurisdiction, which are bound to arise with increasing frequency. India's entity cannot pick and choose, and because extraterritoriality is negative, turn blind eye. Simultaneously, Indian entities cannot broaden territorial jurisdiction principle and thus allow extraterritoriality to disappear because it blurs the distinction between the fact and its justification. Indian entities need to devise legal, political, and certainly economic canvas for a broader understanding of extraterritoriality. Extraterritoriality encompasses all jurisdictional claims which are not exclusively territorial because they include a relative, relevant foreign element. Even unilateral economic sanctions with extraterritorial reach can be legal under the broad scope of the permissive principles. However, recent examples in US sanctions law show a troubling tendency to overstretch the traditional jurisdiction principle and even to assert new jurisdictional heads such as the correspondent account jurisdiction, as I mentioned earlier. In order to reconcile its sanctions regime with international law, US should exercise more restraint with regard to the traditional jurisdictional principles and abandon the concept of correspondent account jurisdiction. One may ponder questions like, can India think of counter sanctions in any area if faced with imminent imposition of the CAATSA? India will face double jeopardy, one under CAATSA and another under Russia's 127 FZ on countermeasures for hostile actions of the US and other foreign states. Can it be held that the role of coercive enforcement will be merely symbolic and will not constitute a critical factor in compelling obedience? With America first, the US sanctions policy towards creative and design and aggressive enforcement are likely to continue? How India, and for that matter other similarly situated economies, should conduct themselves when these economic controls are just political ends? The 2017 and 2000 incidents, the Zharab case, Taiwanese company bringing oil, Chinese company ZTE pleading guilty, present issues at the intersection of international criminal law, foreign relations law, public international law, and bankruptcy and corporate law. Last but not the least, one economic analysis as soon as CAATSA was out, the import-export between India and these countries went down. As the US undergoes transition and as our security priorities become more sharper, it will be very interesting to see how India can fully protect and promote its security interests in the next few years in this controversial sanctions regime. Thank you. Jai Hind.